Greetings, salutations, and good now. Welcome to the channel. I'm Kevis Major, doing it major. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about the astrological significance of Easter, or what does Easter mean through the lens of astrology. Now, we're going to go straight into it, but we're going to, talk about some other deeper aspects because, as we know, in, in our society today, some people look at Easter in a lot of different ways. Now, we're going to talk about the astrological lens, and then we're going to talk about, how other people view it. Maybe just, commercialism with, the Christian backative of everything. Or maybe they have some sort of other ideology. Okay, so in this video, we're going to try to discuss them all. Now, Easter is basically the celebration of the fixated portion of the Aries season. Okay, the fixated portion of the Aries season, which is the spring equinox. Now, the spring equinox is the time where we start to experience less darkness and more sunlight in the northern hemisphere. Okay, so there's less darkness. We're going out of winter into spring, and that's it. Right, it's the transition from winter into spring. And so that fixated point 10, those 10 degrees to the 20th degree in Aries, is the spring equinox. And that's when we start experiencing more daylight. Actually, in the northern part of the hemisphere, they are going to be experiencing 3 to 6 more minutes of daylight every day up until, the summer solstice, or, the peak of the summertime, right? Where it's, balance 50-50. And then we start to go backwards into the autumn, start in the process all over again. All right. But now we're just coming out of winter. So basically, the winter zodiacs, or Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, those 3 months. Okay. So, coming out there is the spring equinox. Now, historically, let's talk about ancient civilizations, especially in the north. Okay, and even in the tropics, the south is going to have a different experience because, okay, so let's talk about the southern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, they're shifting away from summer, okay, into autumn, because as we go more towards sunlight, right, as we go more towards the sun, they're moving away. Okay, so we are going into the light and they're coming away from the light. So they're going to experience less light as the northern hemisphere experience more light. And that's important as we, talk about, Easter in its totality, because what we experience as spring is only spring in certain places. Basically the northern hemisphere, the equator has a change. Basically, we see it as the shift between wet and dry. We do feel slight aspects. However, it's not as major as the northern hemisphere, and in the southern hemisphere, they have a different effect. Okay, so ancient civilizations throughout, human existence have, you know, paid homage, or they made reference or noticed or highlight or celebrated, created customs, rituals, drawings, statues around this shift because it's a prominent shift. Think about it being cold for 3 months and then wow, we got sun, you know? And so throughout all human existence, that is a noteworthy change, right? So much so that people created, again, customs, beliefs, traditions, rituals around that time. And basically that's it in a nutshell. right? Um, we could think about, all of the effects, um, from weather to temperature to, the effects on the atmosphere, plant kingdom, marine life, plant kingdom, even humans drew from that transition. A lot of people hibernate, we're inside, it's cold, we need to adjust and adapt. And so, yeah, the, you know, changes are very, very apparent. So we could see why people are celebrating this, commemorating this. Um, we are outside, we are springing forward, we are busy. All of the themes of, Aries season, we are growing. Um, Probably people are pregnant because we are all inside being warm, cuddling up together. So a lot of, you know, intimacy at that time. So Aries, 3 months in or 2 months in, even 1 month into a pregnancy, people are showing a lot of, signs and changes of growth and, springing forward, right? And so, the different cultures, and civilizations as they evolve and advance, they again solidified, this celebration through, rituals and, even surrounding religions, right? We know that the Jewish people, had their own celebration around this time. Look at Greeks, that was a dominant civilization. They had, a celebration during that time, you know. And even if we want to go as far back as Sumerians or go back to, you know, Egyptians, Babylonians, any kind of, you know, early organization of people, that experienced that transition, right? It's a huge thing. All right. So saying all of that to really cement home, what happens astrologically during this time. This Easter today is what? The third. So we are about 14 degrees into the Aries season. And then on Monday, Easter Monday, is going to be what? About 17, 18 degrees. So again, in between those, you know, second modality, 10 and 20 degrees of the Aries season, the more fixated portion. And that's when we really, start getting more sunlight, less darkness. And even if you want to look at it metaphorically, which we're going to dive into, the more religious aspect now of Jesus dying, going down into hell, down into the darkness, the sun being down in darkness, and then coming up, we're receiving more sun. So the sun, is further away from us, we're experiencing more darkness, and then it rises again. Okay, so let's pause for cause and then come back in with part two. All right, if you've gotten this far in the video, drop a comment. Let me know what's good with you, where you're from. If you're, really vibing with the content, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and let's build to the conversation. What do you think about Easter? No, that was Easter in a nutshell. Astrologically wise, I hope that you guys understand, the backdrop. Now we're gonna get into, some deeper layers. Okay, we talked about early civilizations, experiencing this change of weather, temperature, the animal, marine life, everything is changing, and so, they celebrate it, they experience it, they embody it, they talk about it, culture, civilization, all of that's being, happening. Okay. But what we know about Easter today is, Jesus dying on the cross, after being betrayed or sold out, and, he dies, but resurrects 3 days later, right? Tells his disciples, continue sharing the good news, and then he leaves the earth, okay? However, we know that, that story just possibly couldn't be true. That's a mystery, that's a phenomenon, that's a miracle. Okay? And that's the foundation of the Christian faith or religion, is to just believe, in these phenomenons, believe in these miracles. Okay? And that's not the only miracle or phenomenon that's in the Bible that we just need to blindly believe. right? Okay, so then we need to go back to, okay, so what really happened? What's the true story? Okay, so what we know is that apparently Jesus was a guy who was Jewish, but he didn't believe in the Jewish norms and traditions. Okay, so he was like a rebel, okay, against the Jewish customs and norms. He was a teacher, he had disciples, and so he was anti status quo. And we know that the Romans were ruling in Jerusalem or in Israel or that part of the earth, okay? And basically, they were, kind of working with the elites back then to control the place. And so Jesus had his teachings and he was against the Jews. And, eventually they conspired to get him killed by the Romans. So he died as like a rebel or like as a thief among criminals. However, the message that he was preaching was quite powerful, and that was one of the reasons why he was killed. And so people continue to hold on to the teachings. Okay, I think you call those people agnostic or unorthodox, but these would be the earliest teachings of Jesus, kind of founded on some agnostic texts, not the Gospels, right? So we are looking at like stuff like the Book of Thomas and stuff like this. I hope the glare is not too distracting for you guys. Okay, so for hundreds of years, people still believed or practiced the teachings of Jesus because, it kind of worked for them as being poor and oppressed people or people who really wanted to tap into, this divine spark. Because if you really check out Jesus' teachings, he was basically telling the people that, hey, you don't need to go through these elites. You could go directly get a connection to God, do God's work, and then be able to enter the kingdom of heaven. This is a fake world. The real world is when we transcend this plane and, ascend into a higher plane. Like some deep, deep, you know, ideologies and philosophies, right? And so for certain people, they, practiced this and believed in this, and it was quite popular for many, many years. So much so that, in the year 300 or whatever, 325, the Council of Nicaea was formed, so the Roman Empire could consolidate power and influence all over their empire, spanning from Rome into, you know, Eastern Europe, going down into, the Middle East area, right? What we consider the Middle East area today. Okay, so during this period, the Council of Nicaea, this is where the Romans essentially, I'm trying to make the story short, but they borrowed, from Greek philosophy, Greek teachings, Jewish practices and influence, or things that could be anti-Jewish practices as well, because the Romans hated the Jews, right? But they realized that they needed a religion or a philosophy, a identity to be able to control their empire. Okay, so we could see that a lot of what we're talking about has nothing to do with Jesus dying or anything. It's about Romans, Jews, Greeks, power, control, influence. Okay, so bear all of that in mind. So the Roman emperor at the time, Constantine, got all of these scholars and bishops together to basically craft this ideology, craft this, book that would be, how they would be able to have a national identity to unify all a lot of masses of people, you know, so that they could control them essentially. And so they would borrow, Greek mythology, blend it with, Jewish mysticism, and, philosophy. Also, they would be mixing bits of animism as well with, the face and teaching, or name of Jesus, because we know that again the teachings of Jesus was quite popular after he died, for those impoverished people. Okay, and so because the Romans were in control, the Jews were in control, all of the slave class, those teachings were prominent because it gave them hope that after all of the suffering from the rich and the elite and the powerful, we're gonna suffer and be poor, but we go to heaven. Okay, so Council of Nicaea consolidates all of these beliefs into the Christian faith or religion of that day. And so that's what everyone basically had to, fall in line to. However, it was, I in my mind it's quite easy because the Greeks are already celebrating, the birth of spring, that transition from winter into spring. They feel it's a lot. Rome feels it's a lot. Everybody feels that transition, so it's easy to draw references or celebrate or highlight that time. However, the difference is that this time everyone should be putting their conscious awareness into the miracle of believing that Jesus, you know, rose again, right? And so that was a major change, because now instead of just celebrating, spring, or what the Greeks were doing or what these people were doing, or the agnostics just, you know, having whatever thing, they made up this story about, okay, Jesus died, but he came back alive. And this is 300 years later. And so for the poor people, that's a great story, for them to conjure up, okay, Jesus is back alive and he's going to come back for them. They get people to believe in the miracle, and everyone is sort of happy because once we get these slaves on our side, they could help us to fight the Jewish faith, right? And all of these poor people, they could help us to fight the Greek elites, and some of the Greeks are happy because in the Christian faith, like, we incorporate astrology and some of their different pagan beliefs and stuff and names in there, right? Okay, so in a nutshell, that's the backdrop of the Easter that we celebrate today, and some of the different factors that contributed to people having to celebrate Easter in relation to Jesus dying and coming back, is because the Romans needed to embolden their slaves, give them a sense of identity so they could be able to control them in a sense. It's pretty daunting, right? Pretty effed up if you ask me. Okay, but because we know the astrology behind it, we could see how if you knew astrology as well back in the day, you could be quite powerful because you could predict or forecast, the weather, the temperature, so you would know how to, make certain moves anyway. But yeah, how they just used, a blend of these different ideologies to create their religion. And actually, there's no real mention of Easter in the Bible until I think in the 1600s. It was more unorthodox. Some people celebrate that time, but it was more pagan up until a certain time, even though people were kind of still forced to believe in the miracle. Anyway, don't want to get this video too long-winded. I hope you guys understand a bit more. Oh, we didn't touch about bunny and egg, um, but again, from the astrological references, different civilizations had symbols and signs. Bunny, they replicate a lot. Let's put it that way. And then an egg is just symbolic of the womb, something coming out, something hatching, giving birth, and so symbolism for springtime, Aries season. Okay, hopefully we could get to do more interesting run through like this, just to see how astrology correlates to what's happening today, and also use it to kind of peer into what's to come. Yeah. All right. So major farewell until we meet or greet again. You already know in the comments down below. Let me know what you think about this one. If you like the breakdown, if we should continue doing stuff like this, or we should just get back into the regular, daily, weekly, um, and monthly forecast. All right, guys. Talk to you in the next video.